do we really want to be a part of that? In fact, if we look at our own economic and political progress, we're actually doing quite a bit better than some of these European nations. So at the moment, there's, they actually did take there have been several what do you call it? The polls, yes, thank you. Polls taken of the populace in Europe, and a majority at this point don't want to join the EU because they like their independence and they are doing very well, thank you. This is kind of the attitude. So that's one thing to watch in the future, and that's really why I'm here, is to give us some things to look out for in the next 2, 3, 6 months to a year in that particular part of the world. And as many of us know, there's a lot going on there anyway. To stress the independence of Turkey that has been mentioned, many of you might remember that in late 2002, early 2003, when Mr. Erdogan had just become Prime Minister of Turkey, the United States kind of, unfortunately, in our own arrogance and self-assuredness, planned on putting a base, an air base, in Turkey so that we could move troops into Iraq. And Turkey said no. So we did not do that. So that Turkey's feeling some of its own independence, some of its own self-assurance. Moving to the issue of Syria. We've all been watching the news of Syria with sorrow, with wonder, with worry. Some of us have friends there. We're trying to figure out what is going on with Syria, and what is the Alawite versus the Sunni, and trying to figure out the different elements of Islam. And the violence, the continuing violent crisis in Syria, which is the direct southern neighbor to Turkey, affects Turkey in several ways. Presents difficulties between these two nations who have traditionally been friendly to each other. They have a vastly different kind of Muslim practice from each other. But they have been partners in trade and in culture and in other ways. But first of all, there is, as many of you know, the refugee crisis and the refugee issue. From Syria's civil war or conflict, refugees moving to several countries, or even within Syria itself. But the last count, roughly, is that about 175,000 Syrians have moved into southern Turkey. And Turkey is saying, that's over the limit that we can handle. So the United Nations has tried to pull together donor conferences to help the refugee camps, not only in Turkey, but in other countries like Jordan. But 175,000 refugees in severe winter right now, being over the limit that Turkey can handle, puts a whole lot of stress and tension into the country of Turkey. What do we do with these people? How do we understand what's going on there? Also, military tensions between Syria and Turkey. In June of 2012, Syria downed a Turkish fighter jet. that Syria claimed had violated airspace. And there have been times, many times, when the internal fighting within Syria has spilled over into Turkey. And when rebel forces were forced to cross the border and refugee camps have actually been attacked, mortar shells into the camps. And thirdly, there are now several Patriot missile batteries and about 400 U.S. troops along the Turkish-Syrian border. There are also missile batteries from Germany and from the Netherlands as a result of the NATO treaties that provides for this kind of defense for NATO countries. Moving just to the interior of Turkey and what's going on there. There's a phenomenon called Erwenekon. You heard the Prime Minister's name?
Erdogan.
Erdogan. Okay. And what is the leading political party, the governing political party? What's the name of it? This is a quiz, not you all. There we go. Justice and Development Party, okay. And Mr. Erdogan is the leader of that party and the Prime Minister of Turkey. Well, there's you've heard of Watergate, we've all gone through all of that. There's Erdogan, which is a takeoff, if you haven't guessed, of Watergate, only this is in Turkey. And it refers to a very, very long trial of hundreds of military officers that Gretchen referred to, charged with plotting to overthrow the Islamic-leaning or Islamic-rooted government of Prime Minister Erdogan's Justice and Development Party. The Committee to Protect Journalists says, quote, "More journalists are in jail in Turkey than in any other country." Now, the members of the Justice and Development Party don't like to hear that, so there are those who will argue against them. C, relationship, I'm going to come back to the generals in a minute. Relationship with Israel. Gretchen mentioned that Turkey and Israel had good relationships. Pretty much, except in May of 2010, Israel, had a deadly commando raid on a Turkish ship that had internationals aboard it who were going to Gaza with humanitarian supplies. Again, it was a Turkish ship, 8 Turkish civilians and 1 Turkish American, which you never hear about, Turkish American citizen, was killed in that Israeli commando raid. And in September of 2011, after being asked numerous times to apologize, Israel declined to do that. And Turkey then downgraded its diplomatic and military ties with Israel and expelled Israel's ambassador. Next item. Tension between the military within Turkey and the Turkish government. In September of 2012, Mr. Erdogan rolled back the military's political power, and that was through arresting and putting into prison and convicting over 330 military officers, including 3 top generals. And they were sentenced to as much as 20 years in prison each. Next, charges of rising repression that have been made within Turkey by human rights organizations, especially against the Kurdish so-called minority. But there are a lot of Kurds in Turkey, some even in the government, as we heard earlier and saw earlier. The International Crisis Group report of September 2012 says that over 700 Kurds died in clashes with the Turkish government in the previous 14 months. So consequently, there's some concern about the oppression of the Kurdish so-called minority. I just want to end with a quote. And it comes from a Turkish newspaper. It says, quote, "Suddenly, Turkey is being compelled to reassess its overall strategy for spreading its influence and interests across the Middle East, including Egypt, Iraq, and Iran." So Turkey is facing a crucial time in their life. So we would encourage questions. There are 3 of us here, and if we can't answer them, we'll find somebody.
We'll send you to the internet.
Thank you very much.
There's a question here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't know who's spinning this information, but I heard a report recently that, I don't know who's spinning this information, but I heard a report recently that stated that the conflict with the separatist Kurds and the conflict with Syria are creating a further tension in that with all the refugees that are entering Syria are also, you're seeing an influx of Kurdish separatists that are coming in with the refugees. Had you come across any of that in terms of that being a concern?
Yes, yes, I have read about that, but there's, I mean, it's entering